Hi, I'm Colin Davis, and this is a recording of the talk I presented at the Experimental Psychology Society meeting in London in January 2018. The title of the talk is Progress in the Quest to Crack the Orthographic Code, and my co-authors are the members of the FPP2 consortium, and I'll tell you who all those people are when I get to the part of the talk that introduces data from a new mega-study that we've recently conducted. We've been trying to understand orthographic input coding for some time now, and I believe that this was first referred to as the quest to crack the orthographic code by Jonathan Granger in a review article published about 10 years ago now. Essentially, we want to know how a printed word selects the best matching word detector in our mental lexicon. We know this is something to do with letters, and I'm not being entirely flippant when I say that. It's important to know that the identification of printed words involves an analytic process in which the system starts by determining the identities of the component letters of the word. So much of the focus has been on how the system binds information about letter identity and position. And in his review, Granger identified three different approaches to this problem: position-specific coding, context-specific coding, and spatial coding. The key differences between these approaches concern their assumptions about representational units. Do we bind identity and position via dedicated units for letters in specific positions, a C in position 1 unit and so on, or via units that encode a letter's position relative to other letters, as in open bigram coding schemes? Or do we assign position dynamically to letter units that are position and context independent, as in spatial coding? These three approaches make quite different claims about the nature of the orthographic input code, and consequently they make different predictions, although sometimes subtly different predictions, about how much a given word detector will respond to a given input. And we have a very good way of testing such predictions. It was invented in the department where I work now at the University of Bristol. And rather impressively, it was invented by a couple of PhD students, one of whom was Glyn Humphreys. The initial paper describing this technique was published in the Journal of the Experimental Psychology Society, Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology. And then a subsequent paper by Humphreys and colleagues used this technique to carefully probe the consequences of letter deletions, substitutions, and misordering. And this paper introduced the notation that's now standard, and which I'll be using throughout this talk, in which we describe primes in terms of the positions of the corresponding letters of the target. So for example, a 3, 4, 1, 2 prime is one in which the prime consists of the third, fourth, first, and second letters of the target in that order. And we use the letter D to represent letters of the prime that are different from any of the letters in the target. One of the key findings from this article was the importance of maintaining relative letter position, which is an idea that I shall return to later on. Subsequent researchers embraced masked form priming and made an important refinement. Instead of asking participants to report very briefly presented targets, Forster and Davis presented targets in the clear and asked subjects to make lexical decisions. That paper was also published in Quarterly Journal. So here a forward mask is followed by a briefly presented prime, which is then succeeded by the target, to which the subject makes a lexical decision. And in the example shown here, we have a transposed letter prime, or 1, 2, 4, 3, 5, 6 prime, and we're comparing that to a baseline unrelated control prime consisting of all different letters, a DDD, DDD prime. And even though participants are not consciously aware of these primes, they have an influence on how long it takes them to make lexical decisions, as we can see in this schematic. So By carefully manipulating the properties of the prime and measuring the resulting priming effects, we can test the predictions made by theories of orthographic input coding. However, there are a couple of problems. The first problem is that there's a lot of variability in lexical decision latencies. And while, of course, this is by no means unique to this field, it's a particular problem here because the critical theoretical differences are often on the scale of 10 milliseconds or less, which is smaller than the standard errors in a typical mass priming experiment. The second problem concerns the integration of the accumulating evidence base. To illustrate this problem, consider a set of experiments like these where different labs test different types of prime conditions. This is science as usual, and each of these experiments can provide interesting data and useful constraints on theories. But at some point, what we'd really like to do would be to integrate these observations so that we can say something meaningful about how prime conditions in one experiment relate to different conditions that were tested in another experiment. And the ability to make those kinds of comparisons could really accelerate progress in cracking the code. But the problem is, we can't make those comparisons. That's because the different labs have slightly different setups. Often there are very small variations in methodology. They may use different languages, different stimuli, different targets, different target lengths, which is an important factor. And of course, they have different participant populations. So all of those differences prevent us from being able to make comparisons across priming effects in different experiments. And that's a real impediment to progress. Fortunately, there is a solution to both of these problems. And that solution is large-scale collaboration across labs. That allows us to test many more subjects than usual so that we can reduce the standard errors and have extremely precise measurements of priming. And if each of the collaborating labs runs exactly the same experiment, then differences across labs or their participant populations are decorrelated from the stimulus manipulation. So that's what we did in the form priming project, or FPP, which we published a few years ago in Adelman et al. 2014. In that experiment, we tested about 1,000 participants on 420 word targets with 28 different prime conditions. And these are the conditions that we tested. Here I'm using the Humphreys notation I mentioned earlier. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 prime is an identity prime. And here we have an unrelated control prime consisting of random different letters. The grey primes here investigate the effects of transpositions at different positions and across different numbers of intervening letters. The brown column here investigates the effects of letter substitutions. Here we're looking at the effect of letter insertions. The green primes here are looking at the effect of letter deletion. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner, we have the so-called extreme anagram primes, which involve more extensive misordering of the target, things like 3, 2, 1, 6, 5, 4. And each of these prime conditions has an associated mnemonic label, and you'll see those labels on some of the graphs I'll be showing you, like this one, which shows the mean priming effects for each of these conditions. And one thing I particularly want to draw your attention to is how small these error bars are. These reflect the standard errors, which are about 1.5 milliseconds. And that gives us the precision we need for testing the models. So we can then ask which of those 3 approaches that I mentioned earlier seems to provide the best account of the data. And what we can conclude definitively on the basis of the FPP is that each of these models, each of these different approaches, has serious problems. The best of them show a correlation of 0.9 between model and data, but each of them run into critical problems, conditions that they get completely wrong. And interestingly, it's often different conditions for different models. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on the specific predictive failures here. For now, I simply want to assert that what the form priming project tells us is that we need a new model. And so in part 2 of this talk, I'll go on to tell you about a new model.